Hi, my name is Harrison Fackrell, and I have a short analysis of a case for increased operating system support in chip multiprocessors, a thesis by David Nellens, Rajiv Balasubramonian, and Eric Brevnand, three computer science students from the University of Utah Honors College. Before I talk about the thesis, though, my preconception of honors theses generally was this. I expected a large, experimentally predicated written component, with little else by way of a product. Watching the other presentations in this class, however, has shown me that although most are, not all theses are like this, and some forgo the written component entirely. Separately, I had also thought of the honors thesis as something that must be done individually, which, as I've discovered, is typical but not required, and in addition, I had expected there to be a formal requirement for submission format even if it allowed multiple style guides. This, too, is not true. There is no codified requirement that concerns the format of a thesis submission. With that out of the way, let's talk about Nellens, Balasubramonian, and Brevnand's thesis. In broad terms, a case for increased operating system support in chip multiprocessors presents research supporting the conclusion that, in the years preceding its publication, measures of computational efficiency were not so pronounced in their increase for operating systems as they were for other softwares, and particularly that improvements in computer architecture impacted OS performance to a surprisingly low degree relative to the effect they had on other softwares. The paper then proposes a novel architecture specifically designed for an operating system, a processor to be used in conjunction with traditional processors that is dedicated entirely to the function of the OS. This abstract, which I've supplied on screen, communicates all of this with admirable efficacy. As you may have judged from the title and from the abstract, this thesis is very narrow in its focus and its audience. The researchers make little attempt to explain unfamiliar concepts to the average reader. Their audience is very much limited to practitioners, researchers, and students in the field of computer science, and the thesis is not written to be presentable or understandable interdisciplinarily. Their engagement strategy is very concise and to the point, and because of this, I find their strategy to be effective for its purpose. It may be difficult to understand without prior CS experience, but it doesn't need to be understood outside of this context. This pattern of optimization that the paper expresses for its audience at the cost of its own accessibility is also reflected in its formatting. It follows the style guide for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE. I have here 3 disjunct pages from the thesis to demonstrate the form and style of the standard. It uses 2 columns, features extensive support for inline graphics, and uses semantic headers. Unlike many style guides, such as MLA or APA, this style guide does not lend itself well to single stream of narrative writing, instead supporting small, chapter-like write-ups about individual components of the thesis. The authors make very effective use of this format, and the graphics and illustrations they include clearly communicate their data points. An example of one of their graphics is visible in the central page shown on screen. The paper's bibliography, with 25 referenced works, is very extensive. It features primarily contemporary research studies, but among the sources, a non-trivial proportion are foundational architecture proposals, seminal texts, as it were, in the field of computer architecture. Many of the attributed authors and researchers are so niche that within the field they have presence, but none outside of it. But Nellens, Balasubramonian, and Brevnand also cite many architectural proposals connected with IBM Corporation, one of the first and most foundational hardware manufacturers and a well-known pioneer in the industry. Despite all this, and their professionalism, the authors' research and conclusions never gained much traction. They published their thesis in 2000, and although their predictions and recommendations are very consistent with the trends of the CS industry of the time, they ultimately proved to be incorrect, for the CS world furthered itself by continuing to increase the efficiency of general processors until the operating system latency was no longer an issue. By my impression, this thesis was very well done and professional, and even if it was not an accurate predictor of industry trends, I still find it to be nearly perfect. Because of the fact that the research is so woven with its own time, continuing the author's research is not very viable. The changing winds of the computer science industry have made for a landscape that is very different from the ones that Nellens, Balasubramonian, and Brevnand found themselves faced with, and their research is not very well adapted to the modern world. Despite this, as a historical case study, the text still retains its value, and in my own studies it will serve as an excellent example of a CS thesis to aspire to. I can use the research and style patterns expressed therein as I begin developing my own research.